The hand tremor was so slight that anyone else would have dismissed it as too much caffeine or exhaustion from another 14-hour workday. But Grace Mitchell saw it differently. She watched from the corner of the conference room as the tremor traveled up his arm, watched his jaw clench involuntarily, watched the barely perceptible sway in his stance. Everyone else was focused on the quarterly projections lighting up the screen. She was the only one who noticed death creeping into the room. Grace Mitchell was 22 years old, fresh out of college, with a communications degree that felt more like a participation trophy than a qualification. She'd been working at Morrison Industries for exactly 3 months as a junior administrative assistant, which essentially meant she fetched coffee, organized files, and tried to make herself invisible during important meetings. Her desk sat in the far corner of the 32nd floor, positioned perfectly to observe everything while being observed by no one. She had learned early in life that being overlooked had its advantages. Growing up as the middle child in a family of 5, with an older brother who was a surgeon and a younger sister who'd been accepted to Juilliard, Grace had perfected the art of existing quietly. Her parents, both professors at the local university, had stopped asking about her plans after she'd chosen a state school over the Ivy League acceptance she'd received. They didn't understand that she'd chosen invisibility as a survival mechanism, not a surrender. She lived alone in a studio apartment 45 minutes from downtown, taking the bus each morning because parking fees would eat up a third of her paycheck. Her morning started at 5:30, not because she was particularly ambitious, but because anxiety had a way of pulling her from sleep like clockwork. She'd make tea, never coffee, and sit by her window watching the city wake up, finding comfort in the predictable chaos of morning traffic. At work, she dressed in muted colors, grays and navies that helped her blend into the corporate landscape. She kept her long black hair pulled back in the same low ponytail every day, wore minimal makeup, and had mastered the art of walking silently in heels. Her coworkers knew her name but little else. She ate lunch alone at her desk, reading medical journals online, a habit she'd developed years ago that most would find strange for someone in her position. The world of Morrison Industries operated on a different frequency than Grace's quiet existence. It was a technology conglomerate that had its fingers in everything from smartphone apps to medical devices, run by the kind of people who believed sleep was a luxury they couldn't afford. The building itself was a monument to productivity, all glass and steel reaching toward the sky, with meeting rooms named after innovators and disruptors. People here spoke in acronyms and metrics, measured their worth in billable hours and profit margins. They walked with purpose, talked with authority, and regarded anyone below senior management as little more than functioning furniture. The air conditioning was always too cold, the coffee was always too strong, and the expectation was that you'd be grateful for both. The company culture prized aggression disguised as passion, rewarded those who spoke loudest in meetings, and mistook exhaustion for dedication. Grace had watched 3 assistants burn out and quit in her first month alone. She'd learned to navigate this world by becoming essential but invisible, efficient but unnoticeable. She organized files with a system so intuitive that no one needed to ask her questions. She anticipated needs before they were voiced, refilled water glasses before they emptied, and had memorized every executive's coffee order, dietary restriction, and preferred meeting room temperature. But most importantly, she watched. She noticed the small things that others missed in their rush toward the next deadline. At the center of this corporate universe was Ethan Morrison, 30 years old, and already worth more than most small countries. He'd inherited the company from his father 5 years ago, and had transformed it from a modest software firm into a global powerhouse through a combination of brilliant strategy and brutal work ethic. He was handsome in that polished way that suggested personal trainers and expensive skincare routines, with sandy brown hair that was always perfectly styled despite his 18-hour days. He commanded every room he entered, not through volume but through presence. When Ethan Morrison spoke, people leaned in. When he made decisions, markets shifted. He had the kind of confidence that came from never having failed at anything that mattered, or at least never having failed publicly. But Grace had been watching him for 3 months, and she saw what others missed. She saw the way he pressed his palm against his chest during long meetings, a gesture so quick most would think he was adjusting his tie. She noticed how he'd started declining lunch invitations, citing back-to-back calls when she knew his calendar was clear. She observed the subtle winces when he stood too quickly, the way he gripped the conference table a little too tightly when making presentations. Last week, she'd seen him discreetly take pills from an unmarked bottle, washing them down with water while everyone was distracted by a heated debate about market expansion. She'd started keeping a mental catalog of these moments, these tiny cracks in his polished facade that seemed to be widening with each passing day. The morning everything changed started like any other. Grace arrived at 7:15, made her rounds ensuring all the meeting rooms were properly stocked, checked that the presentation equipment was functioning, and settled at her desk to review the day's schedule. The executive team had a critical meeting at 9 with potential investors from Singapore, a deal that could secure funding for Morrison Industries' expansion into Asian markets. She'd been preparing for this meeting for weeks, creating backup copies of all presentations, ensuring dietary accommodations for the visitors, even researching cultural etiquette to share with the team. But as she watched Ethan arrive at 8:30, something felt different. His usual stride seemed forced. His shoulders held with a tension that spoke of more than just pre-meeting nerves. She wasn't supposed to be in the meeting. Junior administrative assistants were meant to hover outside, available if needed, but never actually present for important discussions. But 15 minutes before the investors arrived, Ethan's executive assistant called in sick, and suddenly Grace found herself inside the boardroom, tasked with taking notes and managing the presentation slides. She positioned herself in the corner, laptop open, trying to occupy as little space as possible. The investors arrived precisely on time. A group of impeccably dressed executives who spoke in accented English and examined everything with calculating eyes. Ethan greeted them with his usual charm, but Grace noticed the slight sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. The presentation began smoothly enough. Ethan stood at the head of the table, gesturing at the screens, showing profit projections and market analysis. His voice remained steady, his arguments compelling. The investors nodded at appropriate moments, asked pointed questions that he fielded with practiced ease. But Grace wasn't watching the screens or the investors. She was watching Ethan. She saw the tremor begin in his left hand, subtle at first, like he'd had too much caffeine. Then she noticed his breathing had changed. Shorter intakes that he tried to disguise by pausing dramatically between points. When he reached for his water glass, his hand shook enough that water splashed onto the mahogany table. He laughed it off, made a joke about needing to cut back on espresso. Everyone chuckled politely and returned their attention to the screens. But Grace saw what happened next. The color drained from his face in a way that had nothing to do with the harsh fluorescent lighting. His jaw clenched and unclenched rhythmically, a muscle spasm he couldn't control. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, and she saw him sway, just slightly, like a tree in a gentle breeze. His eyes, usually sharp and focused, seemed to struggle to track the information on the screen. And then she saw it, the thing that made her stomach drop and her heart race. His left arm went limp at his side, hanging at an unnatural angle while he continued presenting with his right, either unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what was happening to his body. Grace stood up. In a room full of people who were paid to be decisive, she was the only one who moved. Her chair scraped against the floor, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the hushed atmosphere of corporate negotiation. Everyone turned to look at her, expressions ranging from confusion to irritation. She was breaking protocol, shattering the invisible barrier that kept people like her separate from people like them. But she didn't care. She crossed the room in quick strides, her heels clicking against the marble floor, and reached Ethan just as his knees buckled. She caught him, her small frame surprisingly strong, lowering him to the floor as gasps erupted around the table. "Call 911, she said, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. "He's having a stroke." The room erupted in chaos. Some people reached for phones, others stood frozen in shock. The lead investor was asking questions in rapid Mandarin to his colleagues. Ethan's eyes were conscious, but confused, trying to speak, but only managing slurred syllables. Grace knelt beside him, loosening his tie, turning him on his side in case he vomited. She'd learned the recovery position years ago, knowledge she'd never expected to use in a boardroom. "Someone get aspirin," she commanded. 325 milligrams if you have it. "Check the first aid kit in the break room. And turn off those screens, the flashing could trigger a seizure." Later, the paramedics would say her quick action had saved his life. The emergency room doctors would confirm it was an ischemic stroke, caused by a blood clot that had been forming for weeks, possibly months. They'd find underlying heart arrhythmia that had gone undiagnosed, masked by youth and physical fitness. The aspirin she'd insisted someone find and place under his tongue had begun breaking up the clot before the ambulance even arrived. Her decision to position him correctly had prevented aspiration when he'd briefly lost consciousness. Every second had mattered, and she'd used each one with a precision that belied her age and position. But in that moment, kneeling on the cold boardroom floor with her boss's head in her lap, Grace felt only the familiar weight of being seen when she'd spent so long being invisible. The aftermath came in waves. First, there was the immediate chaos of the ambulance arrival. The paramedics taking over with professional efficiency while she stepped back into the shadows. Then came the questions from human resources, security, and eventually the police, all wanting to know how she'd known, what she'd seen, why she'd acted when no one else had. She answered honestly but minimally, uncomfortable with the sudden spotlight. The other executives looked at her differently now, some with gratitude, others with a suspicion that suggested they were recalculating her place in their carefully ordered world. The investors had left quietly, the deal temporarily forgotten in the face of mortality's sudden appearance in their sterile corporate environment. Within hours, the story had spread throughout the building. Grace Mitchell, the quiet girl from the 32nd floor, had saved the CEO's life. People she'd never spoken to suddenly knew her name, stopped her in hallways to ask for details she didn't want to give. Her phone rang constantly with calls from reporters who'd somehow gotten her number, wanting to know about the heroic assistant who'd recognized the signs of stroke when a room full of Harvard MBAs had missed them. She deleted the voicemails without listening, ignored the emails from morning shows wanting interviews. This wasn't what she'd wanted. She'd simply done what needed to be done. Acted on knowledge she'd hoped never to need. Her supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who'd barely acknowledged her existence for 3 months, suddenly treated her like a daughter. She was offered the rest of the week off, which she declined, knowing that sitting alone in her apartment would be worse than enduring the stares and whispers. Coworkers brought her coffee, insisted on taking her to lunch, peppered her with questions about how she'd known what to do. Some called her a hero. Others, the ones who whispered when they thought she couldn't hear, suggested she'd been watching Ethan too closely, that her attention had been inappropriate for someone in her position. But the hardest part was the gratitude. Cards arrived at her desk. Flowers from board members. Gift baskets from clients who'd heard the story. Each gesture of thanks felt like a weight, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. She hadn't saved Ethan Morrison because she wanted recognition or reward. She'd done it because she'd seen what others missed, because her particular way of moving through the world quiet, observant, always watching from the margins, had positioned her to notice what mattered. The attention felt like punishment for doing the right thing. At night, alone in her studio apartment, she'd sit by the window and think about patterns, how the body revealed its secrets in small ways if you knew how to look. She thought about her grandmother, the one who'd raised her for 2 years when her parents were finishing their doctorates, the one who'd died of a stroke when Grace was 12. She remembered sitting by her grandmother's hospital bed, watching the monitors, asking the nurses to explain what each reading meant. She'd been too young to help then, too small to do anything but watch as the woman who'd taught her to bake cookies and tell stories by the fireplace slowly faded away. That was when she'd started reading medical journals, started learning the language of symptoms and syndromes. Not because she wanted to be a doctor that was her brother's path, but because she needed to understand how the body betrayed itself. How death could creep in through small failures that accumulated like interest on a debt. She'd spent her teenage years volunteering at the local hospital, not in any official capacity but just sitting with patients who had no one else. She'd learned to recognize the signs of distress that medical professionals sometimes missed in their rush between rooms. She'd seen how a slight change in breathing pattern could signal respiratory failure, how confusion could mask as anger, how the body had its own language that most people never bothered to learn. Her parents had found her interest morbid, tried to redirect her toward more appropriate hobbies for a teenage girl. But Grace had persisted, quietly, the way she did everything. She'd taken first aid courses, CPR certification, even audited emergency medicine lectures at the community college. The knowledge had become part of her, integrated into the way she saw the world, until watching for symptoms was as natural as breathing. 3 days after the incident, Grace received a call from Ethan Morrison's assistant, his temporary replacement, since he was still in the hospital. Mr. Morrison wanted to see her. The request felt more like a summons than an invitation, delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that barely masked its underlying command. She thought about declining, claiming she was too busy or unwell, but knew that would only delay the inevitable. So she agreed to visit that evening, after the office had emptied, and she could slip away without attracting more attention. The hospital's cardiac unit was a different world from the corporate boardroom, all soft beeping and hushed voices instead of ringing phones and decisive declarations. She found Ethan in a private room that looked more like a hotel suite than a medical facility, with actual artwork on the walls and a view of the city skyline. He was awake, propped up in bed, looking smaller without his tailored suit, and practiced confidence. The monitors beside him tracked his vital signs in steady rhythms, numbers she automatically cataloged and assessed. When he saw her, he tried to sit up straighter, a reflexive gesture of dominance that the IV lines made impossible. "Grace," he said, and she was surprised he knew her first name. His voice was different, rougher, like he'd been gargling gravel. "Please, sit down. And thank you for coming." She took the visitor's chair, positioning it far enough from the bed to maintain professional distance. The silence stretched between them, the kind that powerful people rarely experienced because someone was always rushing to fill it. But Grace had learned long ago that silence could be a form of communication. "They tell me you saved my life," he finally said. "That if you hadn't acted when you did, I'd be dead or significantly brain damaged." The clot was massive, apparently. Minutes mattered. She nodded, not trusting her voice, not knowing what response he expected. "I need to know," he continued. "How you knew. My own doctor missed it. I missed it. But you saw something. What was it?" So she told him. Not about her grandmother or her years of quiet study, but about the tremor, the breathing changes, the facial drooping he'd probably been unconsciously compensating for. She listed each symptom with clinical detachment, watching his face change as he realized how many warning signs his body had been sending. "I've been having headaches for months," he admitted when she finished. "Dizzy spells I blamed on dehydration. Chest pains I attributed to stress. I took aspirin for the headaches, which probably prevented this from happening sooner. Pure luck." His laugh was bitter. "I want to offer you a job," he said suddenly. "Not as an assistant. As part of our corporate wellness initiative. We clearly need someone who can see what others miss, someone who understands that productivity means nothing if our people are dying at their desks. The board has already approved the position. Chief Wellness Officer, reporting directly to me. The salary would be significant." Grace felt the offer settle over her like a net, trapping her between gratitude and dread. This was the kind of opportunity people like her weren't supposed to receive, a leap from invisible assistant to C-suite executive that violated every unspoken rule of corporate hierarchy. "I need to think about it," she said, the words coming out steadier than she felt. Ethan looked surprised, clearly unused to people not immediately accepting his offers. But he nodded, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "Of course. Take your time. But Grace, what you did wasn't just about medical knowledge. It was about caring enough to act when everyone else was frozen. That's not something you can teach in business school." Back at the office, the atmosphere had shifted. News of Ethan's job offer had somehow leaked, probably through his temporary assistant or someone on the board. The whispers followed her like shadows, conversations stopping when she entered rooms and resuming the moment she left. Some colleagues congratulated her with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Others avoided her entirely, as if her sudden elevation might be contagious. Patricia, her supervisor, alternated between prideful claims of having always known Grace was special and barely concealed resentment at being bypassed by someone she'd considered beneath notice. The resistance came in small ways at first. Her keycard suddenly stopped working for certain floors, requiring multiple calls to security to resolve. Emails began disappearing from her inbox, important messages mysteriously routing to spam. Someone started a rumor that she'd been secretly dating Ethan, that the whole rescue had been staged to secure her promotion. The cruelty was precise, designed to make her doubt herself, to convince her that accepting the position would be a mistake. She recognized the tactics from every workplace drama she'd witnessed from her corner desk. But there were allies too, unexpected ones. The head of human resources, Demi Washington, who'd built her career on reading people, took Grace to lunch and shared her own story of being the first black woman in senior management, the subtle and not so subtle ways she'd been tested. "They'll try to make you small," Demi said over salads neither of them touched. "They'll want you to apologize for disrupting their comfortable dysfunction. Don't let them." The chief technology officer, Marcus Williams, stopped by her desk to mention that his daughter had epilepsy, that he understood the importance of having someone who could recognize medical emergencies. These small gestures of support felt like life rafts in an ocean of professional hostility. Grace spent sleepless nights wrestling with the decision. She thought about her comfortable invisibility, the safety of being overlooked. She thought about her student loans, the studio apartment she could barely afford, the bus rides that bookended each day. She thought about her grandmother, who'd cleaned office buildings at night so her grandchildren could work in them during the day. She thought about all the time she'd bitten her tongue in meetings, swallowed suggestions that might have improved processes because speaking up wasn't her place. She thought about Ethan Morrison, alive because she'd chosen visibility over safety, action over protocol. And slowly, the decision crystallized. Fear of change couldn't outweigh the opportunity to create it. A week passed before she made her decision. She found herself standing in the boardroom where it had all happened, early morning sunlight streaming through the windows and illuminating the spot where Ethan had collapsed. She thought about patterns again, how sometimes disruption was necessary for growth, how comfortable systems could become tombs if left unchallenged. Her phone buzzed with another reporter's request for an interview. Another chance to tell a story she didn't own. She deleted it without reading and sent a different message instead. 2 words that would reshape her world. "I accept." The transition wasn't smooth. Her first day as chief wellness officer began with someone having taped a stethoscope to her office door, a joke that might have been funny if it hadn't carried such sharp edges. Her office, and the fact that she had one still felt surreal, was on the executive floor, positioned between legal and operations like a buffer between 2 warring nations. She'd insisted on keeping her modest wardrobe, refusing the shopping trip Patricia had suggested to help her look the part. She set up her desk with the same quiet efficiency she'd used as an assistant, adding only one personal touch, a small photo of her grandmother, a reminder of why she'd learned to watch for signs others missed. The real work began immediately. She implemented mandatory health screenings for all executives, a policy that met with resistance until she shared anonymized data about stress-related illness in their workforce. She created quiet spaces on each floor where employees could retreat when overwhelmed. Rooms painted in calming colors, with soft lighting, and no corporate messaging. She instituted walking meetings, convinced the cafeteria to add healthier options that actually tasted good, and started a program where employees could take mental health days without providing detailed explanations. Each change was small, incremental, designed to shift culture without triggering the organizational immune system that had tried to reject her. But the most significant change was in how people began to see her. Slowly, employees started stopping by her office with concerns they'd never felt safe voicing before. A programmer admitted he'd been hiding panic attacks, terrified they'd make him seem weak. A marketing director revealed she'd been skipping her diabetes medication because the side effects interfered with her presentation schedule. An intern confessed he'd been sleeping in the building because he couldn't afford rent and food on his salary. Each story was a reminder that the corporate world's glossy surface hid countless struggles. 3 months into her new role, Ethan called her into his office. He'd returned to work gradually, his schedule modified to include actual rest, his diet monitored by the nutritionist Grace had hired. He looked healthier than he had before the stroke, the artificial energy replaced by something more sustainable. "I need to tell you something," he said, gesturing for her to sit, "about why I really offered you this position. It wasn't just gratitude, though that's certainly part of it." He told her about his father, the company's founder, who died at his desk at 55, how everyone had called it a heart attack brought on by success, as if dying for your company was something to aspire to, how Ethan had found him during what was supposed to be a quick visit to discuss quarterly projections, already cold, having been dead for hours while his assistant assumed he was in an important call and didn't want to be disturbed. "I promised myself I'd be different," Ethan said, his voice carrying the weight of broken promises. "But I fell into the same patterns. When I felt that stroke beginning, all I could think about was my father. And then you were there, seeing what he'd needed someone to see, doing what someone should have done for him." The revelation shifted something between them, transforming their professional relationship into something more complex. Not friendship exactly, the power dynamics were too complicated for that, but a mutual understanding born from shared recognition of mortality. Ethan became her strongest advocate when board members questioned her methods. defended her programs when CFOs complained about costs. He also became her most visible success story, living proof that acknowledging human limitations didn't mean sacrificing achievement. The resistance never fully disappeared, but it evolved into something more manageable. The anonymous notes slipped under her door became less frequent, the whispered conversations less cruel. Some of the strongest opponents to her appointment became unexpected converts after experiencing their own health scares or watching colleagues benefit from her programs. The head of sales, who'd publicly questioned whether a 22-year-old could understand executive stress, became a champion of her walking meeting initiative after his blood pressure medication was reduced. Change happened slowly, measured in small victories and incremental shifts rather than dramatic transformations. Grace found herself changing too. The girl who'd perfected invisibility learned to stand at podiums and address hundreds of employees. She developed a voice in meetings, learned to push back against resistance without apology. She hired a team of wellness coordinators, each chosen for their ability to see beyond surfaces, to notice the small signs that revealed larger truths. She created partnerships with local mental health providers, ensuring employees had resources beyond what the company could offer. She even started a mentorship program, pairing senior executives with junior employees in relationships designed to break down hierarchical barriers and create genuine connections. But she never forgot the importance of watching from the margins. She scheduled regular tours of every floor, not as an executive making appearances, but as someone genuinely interested in how people were doing. She ate lunch in the cafeteria, rotating tables to sit with different departments. She kept evening hours once a week when anyone could drop by without an appointment, creating space for conversations that couldn't happen in formal meetings. She noticed things others missed. The accountant who'd started wearing long sleeves to hide self-harm scars, the security guard whose limp was getting worse, the cleaning woman who hummed to mask her labored breathing. Each observation became an opportunity for connection, for the kind of care that had once saved a life in a boardroom. A year after the stroke that changed everything, Morrison Industries was recognized as one of the healthiest workplaces in the country. The award ceremony was held in the same boardroom where Ethan had collapsed, transformed now into a symbol of renewal rather than crisis. Grace stood at the podium where he'd once presented to investors, looking out at faces that had gone from suspicious to supportive. She thought about mentioning her grandmother, about explaining how loss could teach you to see differently, but decided against it. Some stories were meant to be lived rather than told. After the ceremony, as executives mingled and celebrated their cultural transformation, Grace noticed someone new. A young man, maybe 23, standing by the windows with the kind of rigid posture that suggested anxiety masquerading as professionalism. He was holding his left arm strangely, occasionally rubbing his shoulder in a way that looked habitual rather than therapeutic. His breathing was slightly labored, the kind of thing that could be dismissed as nervousness but might signal something more serious. She watched him for a moment, cataloging symptoms the way she'd learned to do. Then, crossed the room with quiet purpose. "Hi," she said, her voice gentle enough not to startle. "I'm Grace. You look like you could use a break. Would you like to sit down?" The young man looked surprised, then grateful, admitting he'd been experiencing chest pains, but didn't want to seem weak on his first day. She guided him to a chair, had someone call the company nurse, stayed with him until help arrived. It turned out to be anxiety-induced, not cardiac, but serious enough that catching it early mattered. As the nurse led him away for a proper evaluation, he looked back at Grace with the kind of gratitude she recognized. The specific relief of being seen when you'd been trying so hard to remain invisible. Standing in the boardroom as the celebration continued around her, Grace realized this was what healing looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but small acts of noticing, repeated until they became culture. She thought about her grandmother again, about the lessons learned in hospital rooms and the knowledge born from loss. She'd built something from that pain, transformed personal trauma into systemic change. The girl who'd once hidden in corners now stood in the center, not because she'd sought spotlight, but because sometimes visibility was the price of compassion. The patterns continued, rippling outward in ways she couldn't have predicted. Other companies started calling, wanting to understand the Morrison model of corporate wellness. She turned down speaking engagements and consultation offers, knowing her work wasn't finished here. But she did accept invitations to mentor other young professionals who felt trapped by their invisibility, teaching them that being overlooked could be a superpower if you used it to see what others missed. She shared her knowledge freely, believing that every person who learned to recognize distress signals became part of a larger network of care. Years would pass before she'd fully understand the impact of that moment in the boardroom when she'd chosen to stand up. Employees would stop her in hallways to share how her programs had saved their marriages, their health, their lives. Ethan would become a nationally recognized advocate for workplace wellness, using his platform to challenge other CEOs to prioritize humanity over productivity. The company would thrive not despite its focus on employee well-being, but because of it. But for Grace, the truest measure of success would always be found in small moments. The tremor noticed, the symptom caught, the life saved because someone was watching. On quiet mornings in her office, before the building filled with the buzz of corporate life, she'd stand by the windows and watch the city wake up. She'd think about patterns and cycles, about how one moment of courage could create waves that touched countless lives. She'd remember the girl who'd chosen invisibility as armor, who'd learned to read bodies like texts because understanding felt safer than being understood. That girl still existed within her, still noticed things others missed, still found comfort in observation. But now she used those skills differently, not to hide, but to heal, not to avoid, but to engage. The morning ritual always ended the same way. She'd check her schedule, review the day's wellness initiatives, prepare for meetings where she'd continue pushing for changes that some still resisted. But first, she'd take a moment to really look at the people arriving for work, streaming through the lobby with their coffee cups and morning exhaustion. She'd watch for signs of distress, for the small signals that suggested someone needed help. It was a habit she'd never break, this careful attention to human fragility. Because in a world that moved too fast to notice, someone had to stand still and watch. Someone had to care enough to speak up, even when silence felt safer. And as she turned from the window to begin another day of making the corporate world a little more human, Grace Mitchell smiled. The shy girl who'd noticed symptoms everyone ignored had found her voice, not in spite of her quietness, but because of it. Not by becoming someone different, but by teaching others to see what she'd always seen. She'd saved a life by noticing. Now she was saving others by teaching them to notice too. And in the end, that was the greatest pattern of all. How one act of courage could teach 100 others to be brave. The building hummed to life around her, filling with people who'd learned to see each other differently. Somewhere, a manager was checking in with an employee who'd seemed withdrawn. Somewhere, a colleague was offering support to someone struggling with a deadline. Small acts, barely noticeable, but together forming a net of care that caught people before they fell. This was her legacy, not the title or the office or the awards, but the simple truth that noticing mattered. That seeing each other, really seeing, could be the difference between tragedy and grace. In another building, in another city, a young woman sat quietly in a corner, watching her colleagues with careful eyes. She'd heard about Grace Mitchell, about the assistant who'd saved a CEO and transformed a company. She'd started reading medical journals, learning to recognize symptoms, understanding that invisibility could be a gift if you used it to help others. She noticed her supervisor's persistent cough, the way he dismissed it as allergies despite its worsening progression. She thought about speaking up, weighed the risk of being wrong against the cost of being silent. And then, remembering a story about a shy girl who'd chosen courage in a boardroom, she stood up and crossed the room. The pattern continued, one person at a time, teaching the world to see what had always been there, waiting to be noticed.